Hello Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. Before I get to the actual topic of the day, let me mention that this week a trailer dropped for the Tolkien movie. It's a biopic about our everybody's favorite author, J.R. Tolkien. Looks pretty cool. It stars Nicholas Hoult. He plays the young Beast in the X-Men movies, among many other roles he's played. And it looks like it's a young Tolkien in World War I, experiencing the horrors of that war, the comradeship he had with his fellow soldiers, recuperating, living in England, and how that translated into his work, The Lord of the Rings. So, could be really good. It comes out in May. I will certainly watch it and give a review of that. So that is for later. But for now, I thought I would talk about the topic of why do elves hate dwarves and vice versa in Lord of the Rings. So Peter Jackson did his version of that in the Hobbit movies. Basically, he laid out that when Smaug attacked Erebor, and the dwarves called for aid, and Thranduil turned his back, and Thranduil and the Mirkwood elves abandoned the dwarves, and so Thorin and company, and you guys are cowards and betrayed us. That worked for the movies. It's fine. Well, it plays into that the notion of Thorin and Thranduil and heightens the stakes. It's not really why dwarves and elves don't get along in Tolkien's world. In fact, in that particular moment, the dwarves did not ask for the elves' help. The elves didn't help, but also there's the thought of could they have even gotten there by the time Smaug had laid waste to everything? Probably not. So that's kind of a non-starter in terms of the list of reasons why elves and dwarves don't get along. That one doesn't really crack, let's say, the top 10. I'm going to give you a list of things that do crack the top 10 reasons why elves and dwarves do not get along. So we got to go all the way back to kind of the beginning of the creation of Arda. This is pre-First Age. I've talked a little bit about this in some other videos, but just to refresh your memory, before there were sentient beings, before the elves and such were created, there was a beautiful, lush, kind of Eden-like place. One of the Valar, Aule, gets impatient, like, hey, we should be having some sentient beings to enjoy the splendor we've created. So he kind of jumps the gun and creates dwarves. Doesn't do it very well because he doesn't have the power to actually create life. And so he creates these kind of automaton-like robot dwarves that only can move around when he directs them to. It's not a great experiment. Iluvatar, God, essentially, who does have the power to create life, chastises Aule for his impatience. Aule is going to just destroy his creation, the dwarves, and Iluvatar's like, no. I can fix them. And so he takes what Aule had already started, the mold of the dwarves, and then works within it and creates life, in essence, the dwarven race that we know today. So, but one of the things he mentions in that moment that's really interesting is he tells Aule, this is in the Silmarillion, often strife, sorry, I should back this up. Basically, Iluvatar puts the dwarves to rest, to sleep. They're going to slumber until his creation, elves, wake up. And then they'll kind of wake up together, more or less, in the world. And so basically, Iluvatar's been working on elves a bunch and kind of doesn't want these dwarves to upstage as elves. So that's why then Iluvatar says to Aule, often strife shall arise between thine and mine, the children of my adoption and the children of my choice. Right? So the children of his adoption are the dwarves, children of his choice, chosen ones, are the elves. So he's already saying there's going to be friction between these two because you jumped the gun and were impatient and created these things that don't really work within the scheme of what I'm trying to make. All right, so that's before they even draw breath. There's already a problem between elves and dwarves. Okay, now we cut to later in the first age. The first age starts pretty much when the elves and dwarves wake up. So it's now the first age starts. Remember, the War of the Ring happens at the end of the third age, so thousands of years later. So we're way early in the process here in the history of Middle-earth. So what you've got are a group of dwarves called the petty dwarves. And there's not a whole lot that Tolkien writes about them except to say that they're outcasts. They're exiled from various dwarven clans. There's several dwarven clans. These, for whatever reason, are like the no-goodniks of the dwarven world. I don't know. Anyway, they get shunned by the dwarves, and they're apparently smaller in stature than a typical dwarf. So they're pretty damn small, and they're kind of uncivilized. They kind of go around in packs. Anyway, but they take up residence in Beleriand. So they've just basically they're hanging out as their own little tribe, the petty dwarves. Well, elves come along and basically start making settlements in what would be petty dwarf lands. Obviously, the petty dwarves see that as an affront, as an attack on them. You're trespassing, taking our stuff. So they attack the elves. The elves attack back. And in fact, don't realize that the petty dwarves are dwarves. They consider them to be animals, and so start hunting them. They're hunting dwarves. That doesn't go down well with the actual dwarven clans. Basically, the dwarves hold a grudge for that for hundreds and hundreds of years after that. There is eventually a treaty that is made between elves and dwarves where that basically, per the legalese of the treaty, it's agreed that, hey, the elves didn't realize these were dwarves they were hunting, so we'll, give them a break in this moment. So while they signed a thing saying they had a treaty, there was still a big grudge being carried because the elves had hunted the petty dwarves. Now, obviously, the petty dwarves had attacked them first, but, it's one of those chicken and the egg things. I should also mention that the elves had a couple, basically looked down on dwarves, more or less, right? One of the things the elvish word for dwarf is naugrim, which is basically translated as the stunted people. And so, it was like basically they would insult them every time they referred to them. And so that didn't, again, doesn't sit well. Dwarves both of these groups have big egos, and one side's knocking the other. It's not helpful to the situation. Later in the first age, again, I brought up what I'm about to talk about in the Luthien and Beren story, but I'll bring this up again because it's pretty damn relevant for this. Luthien's dad is King Thingol, elven king. Okay, King Thingol hires some dwarven smiths to take two of the most valuable objects in the world and combine them, right? So he's got one of the Silmaril gems, the most valuable gems in the world, and he's been given, it's a long story which I won't go into now, maybe I'll do another video on that, but he came into possession of the Nauglamir, which is this necklace that the dwarves had originally, the dwarven smiths had originally made. It's incredibly valuable. It's got gems from Valinor in it, so the Valar's gems are attached to this necklace. And so Thingol says, hey, I want to take my Silmaril gem and combine it with the Nauglamir to make this incredible necklace with this amazingly valuable gem in it. So he does. The dwarves do the work. there's a little bit of hint that, much like the ring, my precious, that the Silmaril has a similar effect on people. So it had a kind of a my precious effect on Thingol. It also had a my precious effect on the dwarven smiths who were doing this work for him. So they create this thing, but they're like lusting after this creation now, and so they want as payment the necklace, which I don't exactly understand how that works. Like, oh yeah, we'll make this necklace for you. What we'd like for you in a payment would be the necklace. Obviously, Thingol's not real impressed with that offer of payment because he wanted it himself. So he basically yells at these dwarves, insults them, probably calls them stunted people. And in their anger at him not giving them this necklace, these workers, these dwarven smiths that he hired, kill him. They take the necklace. Starts up this major war between elves and dwarves. What ends up happening is those who tried to steal the necklace, in their attempts to flee elvish territory, most of them are killed off. A couple of them survive, didn't get away with the necklace, but they report back to their dwarven lords, hey, we were attacked and killed. They don't really bring up the fact that they were the ones that just killed Thingol for a necklace. But they enrage, they lie basically. They tell the best case scenario about what, their side of the story. It convinces the dwarves that they should go and attack the elves, and so they do, and pretty much, crush the elves, ransack the place, take a whole bunch of treasure, including the necklace, and depart with their ill-gotten gains. As an act of vengeance, Baron of the Baron and Luthien story, because it's obviously his father-in-law was the one who was killed off, and it's Luthien's lands. He feels indebted to go get revenge, and he kills all of the dwarves who survived this attack, and throws all the treasure into the sea except for the necklace. He gives the necklace back to Luthien, and then Luthien ends up wearing it, so she wears the Silmaril. That has its own ramifications for later on, but that's another story. In any case, dwarves and elves didn't get along in this moment, and this was more so even than the hunting of petty dwarves. This thing where Thingol was murdered, and then there was this major war between elves and dwarves. That was the first really serious problems that developed between elves and dwarves. So that's First Age. Okay. Now we get into the Second Age, and there's I know obviously in Lord of the Rings, when we talk about Moria and how on that western gate there's the inscription written in Elvish, right? Speak, friend, and enter. So you might be wondering, it seems like elves and dwarves got along at some point in there, and they did. So the elves that lived just to the west of Moria lived in Eregion, and they had amongst one of their leaders was Celebrimbor. Now, Celebrimbor is the smith who created the 3 elven rings. So, that would be enough for most resumes. But anyway, he also was a friend of the dwarves. One of the things he really liked was the fact that the dwarves had mithril, and as a smith, he really liked working with mithril. So, the actual entire inscription that's written on that door, because the door itself was made by Narvi, the dwarf. We don't know much about Narvi. I assume he must have been a dwarven lord. He wasn't Durin, obviously, who was the lord of Moria, but he must have been a higher up, but he also was a craftsman. So he made those doors. They fit flush. They fit, they can disappear into the stone wall. It was really amazing craftsmanship. And the inscriptions were all done by Celebrimbor. And that's actually the full inscription doesn't just say speak, friend, and enter, right? It says, the doors of Durin, Lord of Moria, speak, friend, and enter. I, Narvi, made them, the doors. Celebrimbor of Holland drew these signs. Okay, Holland is another name for Eregion. Eregion was the Elvish word for it. It was called Holland by humans, mainly because it had a bunch of holly trees. And so it was Holland. Okay, so you could see there, wow, looks like they were getting along. And they did. The doors would actually remain open most of the time, and there was free flow of traffic between the elves and the dwarves. What ended up happening, though, because of those rings, and there was Sauron was trying to get all the rings, and Sauron attacks Eregion. The dwarves actually, I believe, sent assistance, tried to aid in the defense of Eregion, didn't help. Eregion gets destroyed, and as a result of Sauron attacking that area, that's when the doors get closed. And so the doors, are pretty much shut for a long time thereafter, because Eregion is destroyed. In fact, Celebrimbor is captured by Sauron, who tortures him for the existence of where these rings are. Celebrimbor holds out. He's tortured to death, essentially, and then put up on a pike and carried around as like a symbol to scare all the enemies of Sauron. It was a bad ending for Celebrimbor. So, in any case, the elves didn't necessarily blame the dwarves for Eregion falling, but that was an attempted friendship that then got cut short. So, in fact, it's kind of interesting. Okay, so I mentioned how elves call dwarves Naugrim, the stunted people. Well, interestingly, the word Moria it's the elvish word for Khazad-dûm, right? Moria means black chasm. It's an insult. It's like, oh, look at that black hole that they made. It's an insult because this is like one of the pinnacle achievements of dwarven civilization and technology. It's a beautiful place, even in its ruins, as we see in the movies. It's the architecture. What? And so basically, for the elves just to dismissively call it, oh, it's the black chasm, blah. It kind of shows they're like, yeah, dwarves. Well, so what makes this interesting is how did Celebrimbor carve, or maybe why is more importantly, why did he carve Moria on the door? He basically carved an insult into the door when he's like, hey, we're all friends here, but this place is a pit. So it's kind of interesting how Moria ended up on the door itself. You would think he would have put whatever, Khazad-dûm or whatever, but he didn't. He put Moria down. It seemed like maybe all wasn't completely well at that time, but it was like a marriage of convenience. You've got the material I want, so yay, we'll just be friends. Anyway, all right, so now we cut to the Third Age, and this is where Durin and company accidentally, free the Balrog. Okay, Balrog comes about, kills Durin, kills a bunch of dwarves, they flee, and the elves in Lothlorien know it's a Balrog. Okay, there's some question as to who knew that Durin's Bane was an actual Balrog, and not a lot of people at the time of the War of the Ring knew that, but the elves in Lothlorien certainly knew that at the time. That would actually count in their numbers Galadriel. So Galadriel knew it was a Balrog, but for whatever reason she doesn't really share that info with people who might be interested in that in later years. But in any case, the Lothlorien elves blame the dwarves. Hey, you guys freed this Balrog. Yeah, you can argue either case. That the dwarves, was it the dwarves' greed that freed this thing, or was it just lying there hiding and wait? And then when Sauron showed up, did it just decide to come and fight the good fight? Who knows? But point being, elves were like, you guys are greedy SOBs, and you freed this horrible thing that now threatens us. Plus, they have a very strong memory/fear of Balrogs from the very first age. Balrogs were used to kill tons and tons of elves back in the day, and a lot of them would have actually been there to witness that. So, yeah, this Balrog showing up wasn't a good thing. In fact, the leaders, Amroth and Limerdel, who were the kind of the rulers of Lothlorien, fled Lothlorien mainly in part because of that. They were like, okay, it's time we should probably head west. That's also a story for another time, because their tale, they didn't survive the trip. Let's put it that way. But needless to say, they left Lothlorien without any ruler for a while. Galadriel steps in to kind of fill the void and becomes the ruler. But a lot of elves left Lothlorien at that point. And it was mainly due to this Balrog that the dwarves had unveiled and boo to the Balrogs. Or boo to the, boo to the Balrog, but boo to the dwarves. The next thing you've got is we'll talk about the Hobbit, right? So in the events of the Hobbit, the dwarves venture into Mirkwood. They're supposed to stay on the path. They don't stay on the path. They get lost. They're going hungry and they're desperate. And the elves start playing tricks on them. And the elves are pretty much jerks to these trespassers, but they see them as trespassers and the enemy, and so end up imprisoning them, obviously. That doesn't bode well. Thorin remembers that. Now they obviously make up, again, it's a marriage of convenience against the orcs in the Battle of the Five Armies, but still, there's some bad blood there, obviously. It's still festering. And so that's kind of the state of affairs for elves and dwarves. I would even mention when the dwarves, the battle between the dwarves and orcs at Moria, outside the gates, Azog and all that, when the dwarves were trying to burn all of their dead, because they had a ton of dead on pyres, they cut down a bunch of trees to burn their bodies, and those were trees that the elves valued highly. And the elves did, again, I don't know. Both sides just found a way to really upset the other on a regular basis. And maybe, goes back to Ilúvatar's prophecy of often strife shall arise between thine and mine. It does, have this nice kind of conclusion with Gimli and Legolas. Gimli, his name becomes Gimli Elf Friend. And in the Fourth Age, when it's time for Legolas decides to go to the west, basically venture off to Valinor, it's he and Gimli go together. Gimli is the first dwarf ever allowed into Valinor. And the fact that he goes there with an elf. Part of the reason they also feel that that Gimli went when he did was he also wanted to meet Galadriel again, and she was already there in Valinor, and so the chance to meet her again after she'd given him locks of her hair and such was a nice meeting. So there's a little nice wrapping up of that two opposing sides can find common ground. I think that is buried a lot in Tolkien's works, is this idea of working together, finding a way to overcome our prejudices to work for the common good. And that's inevitably what Gimli and Legolas do. So there you go. A little bit of the history of why elves and dwarves do not get along in the Tolkien universe. Thanks so much, everybody. I will see you later. Bye now.